April 18, 1943, 9:15 local. Southwest coast of Bougainville, northern Solomons. Two dark specks descend through haze. 16 P-38s rise like thrown knives. The admiral, whose timetable defined a war, is exactly on time. April 18, 1943, 9:34, off Moila Point, Bougainville. Drop tanks tumbled into the sea. 16 P-38 Lightnings, stretched thin over 430 miles of ocean, snapped throttles forward. Over the radio, a clipped voice barked, "Bogies! 11 o'clock." The strike had arrived not a second late, but a minute early. Major John W. Mitchell's formation split as planned. The killer section, 4 Lightnings led by Captains Rex T. Barber and Thomas G. Lanphier, Jr., peeled toward the 2 green G4M1 Betty bombers. Above them, the top cover from the 12th and 70th Fighter Squadrons climbed hard, holding formation at roughly 18,000 feet to meet any Zero escorts. Months of planning, hours of wave-top flying at barely 50 feet, had converged into a single point of sky. Through binoculars back at Kahili Airfield, Japanese ground crews had watched the twin Genjin bombers depart earlier that morning, confident under the umbrella of 6 A-6 M30s. The escorts were flying around 6,600 feet, comfortable cover in their view, had this been a chance encounter. What they did not anticipate was an American ambush timed down to the minute. In Japanese records, the day would register as 2 bombers lost, escorts returning with little damage, no Zeros were written off. Barber later remembered the shock of seeing one of the bombers streaming smoke, a black column rising from jungle canopy after it cartwheeled into the trees. His wingman, Lieutenant Ray Hine, never came home. He had refused to break from Besby Holmes, whose drop tanks jammed. That loyalty carried both men into combat, and only one survived. The irony began here. Precision and predictability, once a Japanese strength, had become the fatal weakness. Later, American pilots would claim Zeros destroyed in the fight. The records tell otherwise. 2 bombers fell, and no escort was confirmed lost. April 13, 1943. 1755 Tokyo. April 14, 1943. Pearl Harbor. Years later, a Navy linguist would recall a curious phrase slipping across his desk. 1 eagle and 2 sparrows. It was shorthand, a hint inside the sprawl of numbers and kana, but it carried the unmistakable scent of something extraordinary. The itinerary message, catalogued in U.S. traffic as NTF 131075, had been sent in the Imperial Navy's standard JN-25D cipher. Japanese staff officers assumed their timetable for Admiral Yamamoto's tour of forward bases was secure. Instead, U.S. radio intercept stations had plucked it from the ether. By the next day, the encrypted text was crawling across desks at FLUPAC, Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, in Pearl Harbor, the wartime successor to Station Hypo. The team was led by Alva Red Lastwell, a wiry, chain-smoking Marine officer who had made a reputation for fast, accurate translations. With him worked Jasper Holmes, a civilian analyst who thought in terms of plausibility and patterns, and Edwin T. Layton, Nimitz's trusted intelligence chief. At FLUPAC, young linguists, including Ensign John Paul Stevens, later a U.S. Supreme Court justice, joined the silent labor. They knew the drill. Months of accumulated cribbing, trial decryptions, and frequency analysis had already given them the building blocks. Cracking JN-25D was never a single eureka moment, but a grind. This time the grind paid off. Piece by piece, the itinerary became clear. Yamamoto would depart Rabaul at 6 o'clock Tokyo time, arrive over Bougainville by 8 o'clock, and land at Balalay Airfield at 9:45 local time. He would be accompanied by 2 Betty bombers, guarded by 6 Zeros. The timing was so precise it could be treated like a railroad schedule. Here lay the irony. The Japanese prized punctuality as a form of discipline, a reflection of order amid the Pacific's vastness. Yamamoto himself was notorious for expecting to-the-minute precision from his subordinates, yet the very rigor meant the itinerary, once exposed, gave the Americans an exact kill window. Precision that inspired confidence for Tokyo now offered opportunity to Pearl Harbor. A personal thread runs through the story. Stevens, then a 23-year-old ensign, later remembered how a seemingly innocuous phrasing in a Japanese message confirmed to him that the translation was correct. To him it was a small thrill, catching the tone of a language across an enemy's wire. To others in the room, it was chilling proof. The commander-in-chief of the combined fleet had just telegraphed his movements to anyone persistent enough to listen. The message traveled swiftly up the chain. Laswell and Holmes briefed Layton, who carried it to Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. For once, intelligence did not offer merely a possible location or general timing. This was a gift-wrapped schedule, complete with departure, escort, and landing. All that remained was the choice, whether to act. At Frupak, some staff wondered if the message could be too good to be true. Was it bait? Was Tokyo careless enough to broadcast Yamamoto's presence? Debate flickered in the decoding room, but the timetable matched what was known of Yamamoto's inspection tours and his personality. The Japanese had long believed Yen 25D to be impenetrable. They had no reason to think otherwise. Historians later called it a triumph of cryptanalysis. Yet the myth of an overnight miracle oversimplifies the work. The truth was less cinematic. Endless intercept logs from outlying stations, meticulous filing, partial solutions compiled over months, and translation by underpaid linguists who often worked into the night. The decrypt was the harvest of many hands, not a sudden lightning bolt. When Nimitz read the translation, the opportunity was unmistakable. Yamamoto's movements were laid out as clearly as if he had filed a flight plan with the enemy. Precision scheduling had become a death sentence in waiting. April 17, 1943. Afternoon. Noumea, South Pacific Area Headquarters. One map on the table. Roughly 430 miles of open ocean stood between Guadalcanal and Bougainville. There was no margin for error. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, faced a stark choice. The decrypt from Pearl Harbor promised an ambush with surgical precision, but acting on it risked revealing the greatest American secret of the war, that Japanese naval codes were broken. Across the table, William F. Halsey, Jr., commander of the South Pacific, argued for action. "We have him," he pressed. To hold back would mean letting Yamamoto continue his inspection tour, inspiring frontline morale only months after Guadalcanal had been lost. The mechanics of the strike were handed to Mark A. Mitcher, head of Allied air operations in the Solomons. His orders would shape one of the most unusual missions of the Pacific, not a fleet engagement, but a fighter squadron intercept over hundreds of miles of water. The tools available were thin. 18 Lockheed P-38Gs were assigned, chosen not for speed or agility, but for their extraordinary range. Each aircraft would carry a mismatched pair of external tanks, 165-gallon and one roughly 310 to 330-gallon unit, sources vary, that gave just enough fuel for the long run north, 15 minutes over target, and a sprint home. Here was the contrast. The Americans debated legality, secrecy, and logistics. The Japanese, convinced their planning was secure, sent their commander with an itinerary as predictable as a commuter train. Ironically, their confidence in the unbreakability of JN-25D meant no one in Rabaul dreamed the Admiral's life was already forfeit. Inside the Noumea operations room, a staff officer drafted the paperwork. To the pilots, the mission would be explained as the result of a Coast Watcher's sighting, an alibi meant to shield the truth of the decrypt. Human fingerprints marked the deception, down to the phrasing of the cover story. One myth later circulated in popular histories that President Franklin D. Roosevelt personally gave the order to get Yamamoto. the records show otherwise. Authorization flowed through Nimitz, Halsey, and Mitscher, a theater-level decision made under the cloak of necessity. Roosevelt may have been informed, but he did not draft the order. When the meeting broke up, the die was cast. Yamamoto's timetable had been accepted as a death sentence. All that remained was to launch the Lightnings and hope the gamble justified the secret they were prepared to risk. April 18, 1943, 7:25, Kukum Field, Guadalcanal. Artwork conflicted. Hot metal shimmered in the rising sun. The air reeked of high-octane fuel, sweat, and grease. Crew chiefs' knuckles were smeared black from tightening last-minute fittings, and the throb of 18 Allison engines made the ground itself tremble. Major John W. Mitchell walked the line with a folded map tucked inside his flight jacket. The marine compass he had borrowed from Luther S. Moore was bolted to the frame of his cockpit. A hedge against Guadalcanal's notoriously unreliable instruments. His plan was exact. 4 legs, all timed to the minute, with strict headings and altitudes. The margin for error was virtually nil. Each P-38 carried an ungainly mix of tanks, one 165-gallon on one wing, one 330-gallon on the other. The extra weight added nearly 3,000 pounds of fuel, making the Lightnings wallow down the steel mat runway. The squadron would skim the sea at 50 feet or lower, radios silent, trusting their watches and Mitchell's math. At the intercept point, the killer section would break off while the top cover from the 12th and 70th Fighter Squadrons climbed to 18,000 feet. If the plan held, they would arrive over Bougainville at 9:34, just 10 minutes before Yamamoto's scheduled landing. But the plan did not hold perfectly. As the Lightnings rolled, 2 aircraft aborted for mechanical reasons. Moments later, Captain Besby Holmes discovered one of his drop tanks had failed to jettison. His wingman, Ray Hine, refused to leave him. That decision, born of loyalty, would cost him his life. The contrast was stark. On the American side, navigation was reduced to compass bearings, stopwatch clicks, and blind trust in Mitchell's geometry. On the Japanese side, the itinerary was as punctual as a train schedule, transmitted without fear of interception. Both systems relied on precision, but only one would prove fatal. Hours into the flight, the formation stretched across hundreds of miles of sea. Pilots fought fatigue, staring at flat horizons with no landmarks, their engines throttled back to conserve fuel. The ocean's surface was their only guide, just 50 feet below their wings. Every ripple looked like a reef, every white cap a possible patrol boat. It was Lieutenant Douglas Canning's eyes that broke the monotony. Nearing Bougainville, he spotted the faint black specks against the morning haze. He called it out over the intercom, his voice measured, calm. Without that sighting, Mitchell's geometry would have remained only math. With it, the ambush became real. The moment was deceptively calm. Each pilot checked gauges, tightened harnesses, and adjusted gun sights. 16 Lightnings had survived the long crawl north. What waited ahead was a 10-minute window of violence. Myth later painted this as a flawless mission. Perfect math, perfect timing. In reality, the squadron's neat formation had already frayed. 2 planes gone, one limping with a hung tank, wingmen shuffling to cover gaps. It was less the clockwork of legend and more a testament to adaptation under pressure. At 9:34, the horizon shifted. Canning's specks resolved into twin Jenners bombers, trailed by a diamond of fighters. Mitchell's plan had brought them here almost to the second. The precision was uncanny, but it was not perfection. It was improvisation, human endurance, and luck, woven into a geometry of war. April 18, 1843, 9:34, 9:42. Southwest, Bougainville. Cannon thumps. 50-caliber guns rattle. The morning calm shatters into the staccato roar of tracers and engines. Captain Rex T. Barber nosed his P-38 into firing position. Ahead, the lead Mitsubishi G4 M1 Betty of the 705th Kokutai glimmered in the sun. Inside sat Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, though Barber could not know it. He lined up and squeezed. A storm of shells and bullets ripped into the bomber's right engine, then stitched along the fuselage. The Betty lurched, wing dipping, flames trailing back across its length. Seconds later it rolled into the jungle canopy, exploding in a black column of smoke. To the right, Captain Thomas G. Lanphier, Jr. slashed across the formation. He fired a high deflection burst at the second command bomber from the same unit. Its left engine caught, sputtering. With its crew fighting for control, it lost altitude and skimmed across the waves off Moila/Koila Point. The pilot ditched it in shallow water. Among the handful who crawled free was Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff. Stunned and soaked, he would later record the scene in his diary with the restraint of duty. The admiral's plane gone, his own survival undeserved. Above and behind, 6 204th Kokutai Zeros fought desperately to break into the engagement. The P-38's peculiar advantage, twin engines and centerline armament, allowed the Americans to hit hard, then climb or dive without the torque that plagued single-engine fighters. But the fight was not without cost. Lieutenant Ray Hine, loyal wingman to Besby Holmes, never returned. Holmes's drop tank had failed to release. Hine stayed with him, covering his friend until the melee scattered them. Japanese pilots reported no confirmed losses of their own that morning. American after-action reports claimed Zeros destroyed, but Japanese records stand firm. Only 2 bombers fell. Barber's P-38 came home with nearly 100 bullet holes stitched across wings and fuselage. He would later insist his fire brought down Yamamoto. Lanphier claimed the same. The dispute began almost immediately, dividing the killer flight into rival camps. Decades later, U.S. Air Force reviews would wrestle with ballistic evidence, flight paths, and testimonies. Historians continue to parse it. But in that 6-minute window, the pilots had little time for credit, only survival. The Japanese perspective carried its own irony. Kahili's ground crews watched in disbelief as 2 command bombers failed to return. What should have been a routine morale tour ended in catastrophe. The loss was not just aircraft or men. It was the head of the combined fleet, felled in the most humiliating way possible, ambushed on schedule by an enemy who knew precisely where he would be. The encounter was brief, brutal, and decisive. 16 P-38s had crossed nearly 500 miles to reach this point. In exchange for 1 pilot lost, they had killed the architect of Pearl Harbor and crippled the Japanese Navy's spirit. Yet the moment was not clean victory. It carried grief in equal measure. Ray Hine missing over the ocean, his loyalty unrewarded. In later retellings, the clash grew larger, more cinematic. Some accounts inflated the kill tally to suggest all the escorts destroyed. The truth is sharper, more restrained. Japanese records confirm 2 Bettys destroyed, 6 Zeros damaged at most, and the combined fleet left leaderless. For Barber, Lanphier, Holmes, and the surviving pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron, the 6 minutes over Bougainville were a blur of smoke and tracers. For Ugaki, watching his commander vanish into jungle fire, it was a moment that would haunt his diary until his own final flight in August 1945. The fight was over by 9:40. Silence returned to the sea and jungle. Smoke marked the place where precision planning met mortality, and the legend of Operation Vengeance was born. April 19, 1943, 7:00 north of Bougainville jungle. Wet leaves clung to uniforms. The sharp tang of kerosene hung over the clearing. Mingling with the insect roar of cicadas, a Japanese search party hacked its way through vines, led by Lieutenant Tsuyoshi Hamasuna, an engineer officer detailed for recovery duty. The wreckage of the G4 M1 Betty was scattered through the trees. aluminum panels bent like paper, engines buried in the soil, fragments still smoldering from the crash that had come the previous morning. In the jungle north of Bougainville, not far from the coast, they found what they had come for: the remains of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He was still recognizable. His hand lay near the hilt of his ceremonial sword. Nearby lay Rear Admiral Rokuro Takata, his staff officer, killed instantly when the bomber broke apart. In all, close to 20 men aboard the two bombers had perished. Hamasuna's party treated the scene with solemnity. Reports describe them lifting the admiral's body with care, wrapping it in white cloth, and forming a quiet honor guard before beginning the slow return to Bougainville. Even amid jungle heat and enemy patrols, ceremony mattered. They built a makeshift bier and carried Yamamoto as if still a commander leading his men. It was a small, human act of respect in the midst of devastation. Official records later softened the details. A biographer, Hiroyuki Agawa, relayed the public version that Yamamoto had been found seated serenely beneath a tree, as though resting. But the medical report told another story: 2 bullet wounds, one through the shoulder and another through the head. The head wound was fatal, leaving no room for the peaceful tableau that wartime propaganda preferred. The upright, tranquil admiral was a legend crafted for morale, not history. In Rabaul and Tokyo, the shock ran deep. Matome Ugaki, still alive after crawling from the surf, recorded in his diary the dual burden of loss and duty. He wrote of grief but also of the unyielding expectation to carry on. For him, survival was not relief, but a responsibility that would shadow his every action until war's end. The irony was bitter. Yamamoto's insistence on punctuality, on the strict discipline of schedules, had made him predictable enough for an enemy to strike. Now, carried out of the jungle by the 6th Special Naval Landing Force, he became both martyr and cautionary tale. In Bougainville, a cremation followed within a day or two, the ashes placed into a lacquered box for transport back to Tokyo. Incense smoke mingled with jungle air, masking the scent of burned aviation fuel. Soldiers bowed in silence. Ceremony endured, even as confidence eroded. The admiral who had once predicted he could run wild for 6 months after Pearl Harbor had been cut down not in battle but on a routine inspection flight. His fate showed his subordinates what Ugaki already knew. Devotion and precision were not enough against an enemy who could see the timetable. April 18, 1943, Guadalcanal, decades later. I got him. No, my fire set him alight. The voices came not from the same cockpit, but from competing memories, colliding across years. Captain Thomas G. Lanphier, Jr. returned from the Bougainville mission brimming with confidence. In his version, his high-deflection burst tore into the lead Betty, sending Yamamoto to his death. Official communiques credited him almost immediately, cementing the story in headlines. But Captain Rex T. Barber remembered it differently. He had tracked the bomber from behind, firing until its engines failed and its fuselage erupted. His P-38 landed riddled with nearly 100 bullet holes, a mute witness to the risk he had endured. The records of 13th Fighter Command told less than either man wanted. Action reports described the intercept, but in the blur of 6 minutes over Bougainville, no one could establish with certainty whose rounds struck the fatal blows. What history inherited was not clarity, but rivalry. The contrast could not be sharper. Official tallies sought a neat attribution, one name for one kill. The reality of aerial combat was chaos, tracers crossing at oblique angles, and memories fogged by adrenaline. Decades later, analysts sifted evidence again. In 1991, the Air Force split the credit. In 2003, the Oregon legislature honored Barber alone. By 2024, historian Daniel Holman firmly concluded Barber's fire brought down Yamamoto. The myth check is simple. Every definitive claim came after the fact. In the moment, only Jungle Smoke knew whose guns had spoken last. August 15, 1945, 1924, Ryukyu Airspace. Near nightfall, 2 years, 4 months, and 27 days after the ambush at Bougainville, Ugaki led his last flight into the dark. The war was already over. The Emperor's broadcast of surrender had reached the fleet that morning. Yet Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, who had crawled from the sea beside Moila Point in 1943, chose to lead one last mission. Strapping into a Yokosuka D4Y Judy, Ugaki took off with men of the 701st Kokutai on what he called a farewell sortie. His plane vanished into the night. Wreckage was never found. For him, Yamamoto's death had never lost its sting. Duty, in his mind, was not measured by peace treaties, but by sacrifice carried to the end. The irony was stark. The Americans had pioneered a decapitation strike in 1943, cutting down Yamamoto with 2 Betty bombers lost and 20 men killed, at the cost of 1 P-38 and a single pilot. Ray Hine still missing. The Japanese officer who survived that ambush became a symbol of futile loyalty, giving his life after surrender had already been proclaimed. Meanwhile, threads of the codebreaking team lived on in unexpected places. John Paul Stevens, once a junior at Frupak, rose to become a U.S. Supreme Court justice. His career embodied the post-war turn from secret warfare to jurisprudence, the contrast of violence on one page and law on the next. At sea, William F. Halsey, Jr. commanded the Pacific Fleet's final hammer blows, closing the circle Yamamoto had once opened. A crew chief on Guadalcanal kept a worn snapshot of Hine in his locker. Japanese families received ashes in lacquer boxes. Loss spoke the same language in both camps. Yamamoto's death did not win the war. It shook morale, proved precision could kill a legend, and left a lesson timetables could not control.